All right. Welcome, educators from around the world. My name is Jennifer, and in collaboration with my Learning A to Z colleagues, we are thrilled to have you in attendance for our International Speaker Series event, Connecting Global Voices. Before introducing today's speaker, I'd like to go over a few items that will help ensure the success of our event. First, there are some features of our platform Zoom that you'll want to be aware of. Specifically, you'll want to make sure that your microphone is muted. That will make sure that we don't have any audio feedback. Also, please feel free if you would like to use your webcam. We absolutely love to see everybody's faces, especially when we can't be near each other. Being able to connect and see one another through these platforms makes these experiences all that better. If you do not want to use your webcam, that is absolutely okay also. What we also hope that you take advantage of is the chat box. My colleagues and I, during our presentation today, will be monitoring the chat box, and we will try to address as many questions as possible. This session is being recorded and will be made available after today's session. Also, please make note of this URL at the top of my screen. This is where you can get tech help if you're experiencing any trouble with the Zoom platform. Also, during our webinar today, I'd like to remind you of our responsibilities we have as digital learners, digital leaders, digital citizens, and digital collaborators. As a large group, our moderators will do our best to respond to questions in the chat box. However, we also encourage professional and respectful engagement between attendees. We also ask again, if you experience any technical difficulties, please go to the Zoom help section in order to troubleshoot any issues you might have. Now, it is my great pleasure on behalf of Learning A to Z's International Speaker Series, Connecting Global Voices, to introduce to you my colleague, Christina Espiojo. Christina is an educator and educational psychologist from Lima, Peru. Christina has a master's degree in English and language arts education from Boston University, where she was the recipient of the Anson Intercultural Research Fund Scholarship. She was also awarded the Klingenstein Summer Institute Fellowship, which she completed at Teachers College at Columbia University. Christina currently serves as the English coordinator at her school in Lima, Peru, where she is passionate about language and literacy development and believes student engagement is key to enhancing learning. Please help me welcome Christina.
Hello, everyone. And thank you, Jennifer, for the introduction. Good morning or good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. I'm really excited to be talking to you today about vocabulary development, which is a topic that I am really passionate about. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here with you. And before we dive in, I'd like you to think about this question for a minute. What does it mean to know a word? When you hear that a student knows a word, what does that bring up for you? If you'd like to participate in the chat room, that would be great. Okay, so I see some people are saying that it means they can understand it, they can picture it in their head, being able to decode it, decipher the meaning, use it in different contexts. Excellent. So already with the different answers that we're getting, we're seeing that word knowledge is complex. It's not just about recognizing a word or just understanding it. At the highest level, it's about applying it, using it in context. And that's what we're going to talk about today, how to help students understand and use complex words. So for today, we're going to begin with why vocabulary matters. Why are we talking about this? And how do students actually learn vocabulary? How do we choose what words to teach? How do we know what words are best for our instruction? How do we make definitions that students are going to be able to understand, that are going to help them acquire the meaning from the very beginning? What strategies, what activities can we do in the classroom that are going to help students to really solidify their understanding of a word? And last, how do we get students to not just be able to use the word during our classroom session, but hopefully to incorporate that word into their own vocabulary, for that word to become something that they are able to use when it comes up in real life? So let's get started. Why does vocabulary instruction matter? So this seems pretty straightforward, but words are the building blocks of communication. So the more words you know, the more precisely, the more shades of meaning you have with which to express your ideas, both orally and in writing. As far as reading, vocabulary is a significant predictor of comprehension and fluency. So word meanings can actually make up as much as 70 to 80% of comprehension. The more words we know and the more words that we can recognize automatically, the more fluently we can read and the more we will understand of what we're reading. And as far as English language learners, they benefit particularly from this direct vocabulary instruction because they are less to English in context. So it is important for any student, but for ELLs, although they are exposed to English in the classroom, they're not getting it at the supermarket. They're not getting it, possibly they're not getting it on the playground, right? So we need to expose them to more words. And although reading is definitely helpful to increasing vocabulary knowledge, direct instruction in vocabulary is actually the factor that has the greatest effect on comprehension. So how do students actually acquire new words? So as we mentioned a little bit in the warm-up question, word knowledge is applied knowledge. It's less about knowing what a word means, but rather knowing how to use it. It needs to go beyond definitions. So learning and knowing words is about connecting to a few different things. First of all, prior experience, being able to connect with feelings and situations that students have been in before. Right? So being able to hear a new word for a feeling and say, I've felt that way before. I can think of a time that that has happened to me, right? Or I can think of something in my life that I could describe with that adjective. Related concepts. So if a student knows the word borrow, then introducing the word lend is all that much easier because they can see the other side of that. Oh, I know what it means to borrow something from someone. Now I can understand what it means to lend. It's the other side of that. And other known words, so synonyms, antonyms, word categories, all of those help to give a new word significance, right? So when we talk about synonyms, a lot of the time we think, well, they mean the same thing. Often synonyms are actually different shades, different, slightly different meanings, right? So if I know the word happy, then when I'm introduced the word content, hopefully I will begin to understand it's a little bit less than happy. But if I'm introduced the word thrilled, well, that's more than happy. That's a more intense feeling of happiness, right? So I'm going to be able to connect by comparison as well. So what does all of this mean for vocabulary instruction, for what we need to do in the classroom? So first of all, what we were just talking about, developing both definitional knowledge and connections to related concepts. We also want to expose students to use of the word in multiple contexts. This is really important so that students don't get stuck in a single situation or use of a word. So for instance, if I were introducing the word insist, and most of my examples come from my mom insists, or my teacher insists, or things that the student isn't going to want to do. So my mom insists that I finish all of the broccoli on my plate, or my teacher insists that I finish my task before I go to recess, right? The student could think that insist is something that has to do with something I don't want to do, right? So we need to give them multiple contexts. We can also say, you know, my sister, a peer, insists that I have the last piece of chocolate cake, right? So that's a totally different use of the word, but is also valid. So multifaceted use of a word is really important, exposing students to these different examples. And this last one is really easy to skip over, asking that students explain their reasoning in their word use, right? So when students explain their thinking, this helps them to figure out what makes this word different from others. We really want them to become a bit more aware of why this word applies to this context and this other word doesn't, right? So as you can see, this is a complex process. There is a lot that goes into vocabulary development. So we can already start to think about the fact that depth of vocabulary learning is more important than how many words are taught. So we do want to prioritize quality over quantity. So how do we choose what words to teach? So it's really helpful to talk about, when we're talking about this, to understand how we can divide up vocabulary words. So basic everyday words, such as table, jump, book, elbow, very straightforward nouns and verbs, are what we call tier 1 words, right? So these are words that native speakers learn in everyday life, and they don't need to be taught. So ELLs don't always know these words, but these are words that are best taught through everyday interaction or games, labeling objects in the classroom. During reading, they can be resolved by pointing at things, drawing, showing a picture of the object, or demonstrating the action if it's a verb. They don't really require deep targeted instruction because they're fairly straightforward words. And even with ELLs, these are generally words that they are familiar with in their own language already. Tier 2 words, on the other hand, are high frequency, high utility words for mature language users. So words like coincidence, fascinating, therefore, malicious, right? So these are words that might not come up as much in oral language and everyday speech, but they will come up a lot in reading. And third, we have low frequency, highly specialized words like osmosis, hypotenuse, larynx, metamorphic. These are very, very content area specific words. So these are best taught by subject area teachers. These are words that need to be introduced in the context of the subject matter, right? So as far as English language instruction, the best words to target for vocabulary are these tier 2 words, these high frequency, high utility words. These are the ones that we're really going to focus on for today's webinar. So a few aspects to consider when choosing vocabulary words. The first question we can ask ourselves is, what words do students need most for the text or topic they're working on? So we want to remember that vocabulary instruction isn't something that should be done in isolation. We don't want to just be choosing random words that we think students may someday need, because the list of words that they might someday need is extremely long, right? So a good place to start is the text that students are reading. That's a really great place to choose words from. Or it doesn't need to be necessarily words that are actually in the text. It can also be a concept that is important to the story. So maybe in the story, someone is greedy. Okay, that word might not come up in the story, but maybe it's a good moment to introduce the word greedy, right? Next, what words are students ready to learn? So what students are within students' reach developmentally? So a good measure of this is to ask, can I explain this word using words that students already know? If I can't put it into terms that students already know, if I need to really draw out an example in order for them to understand what it is, that might be a difficult word for them still. Right? So resourceful might be too complex for 6-year-old ELLs, right? Maybe that's a bit too abstract, but it might be appropriate for 11-year-olds. The next question we want to ask is, which words will students be most likely to use in other contexts? So is this word worth teaching? Is it something they might be able to express in their daily lives? So the more that students can personally connect to the word, the better they'll acquire it. So an 8-year-old might not have much use for a word like entrepreneur in their lives. They can definitely understand it, but maybe that's a word that I can just resolve as we're reading and say, entrepreneur, that's someone that does business, right? That's a businessman or woman. And last, how many words to teach at a time? So this is, of course, going to depend on students' age and on their English proficiency. But if we're thinking about in-depth vocabulary instruction, the words that we're going to be focusing on for a week or two, usually 4 to 8 is enough. We don't want to do more than 10 at a time, because if we're introducing 20 words, that's too many for a student to juggle. 20 meanings would be a lot for them to keep track of at the same time. So I do want to be clear in this that I am talking about words that we're focusing vocabulary instruction on. We can, of course, introduce other new words orally or during reading at the same time. So as you can see, all of these are really tied to the teacher's judgment based on knowledge of their students' skills, needs, and their first language. This is vital. There is no correct answer to what words we should be teaching at a certain grade level or with a certain text. It's really going to depend on our students' needs. Why do I mention first language, for instance? If our students do share a first language, then cognates are something we also want to take into account. So thinking of my context, my students all share Spanish as a native language. So maybe a word like preference, which is so close to the word preferencia in Spanish, maybe that's not a word I need to prioritize because they're going to be able to work that out pretty easily because of that cognate. So I'd like to show you a short story as an example for you to think about what words you might work on with your students. You can think about this for your own students, or you might think about it for say second or third graders. This is more of an elementary example, and I have underlined the tier 2 words. So take a look at that and choose just 2 or 3. If you'd like, you can type them in the chat box as well that you might decide to focus your instruction on. Okay, so I've seen a few people mentioning some of the tier 2 words that are in this text. So of course, as I said before, it's really going to depend on our own students' skills and needs. But if we frame it around the questions that I mentioned before, one that might be central to understanding the text, assuming my students don't already know this word, might be failing. Right? So this story, we need to understand that the fox has failed at what he set out to do, which is catch these grapes, right? So that might be a good word to introduce if my students don't know it. Something that might connect to all students' experience, appetizing. Who can't relate to looking at something and thinking, ooh, that looks really, really yummy, right? So that would be one that students could connect to easily. Words that will come up in a lot of other contexts might be finally or decided. Again, these might be words that students already know or might be cognates of things in their own language. But mutter might be another one that they could use in other contexts as well. So how do we make definitions that are friendly to students? So you might have noticed that dictionary definitions are not always very friendly, but classroom definitions definitely should be. So before we look at some positive examples, let's think about the things that we want to avoid when creating a definition for our students. So one is definitely abstract expressions, things like the state of or lack of, or using one instead of saying someone, the absence of. So a definition for realize, such as the entrance of an idea into one's mind, that's pretty abstract, particularly for elementary school students, right? That really doesn't help them to grasp the meaning easily. We also want to avoid relying, on a closely related word. So if I'm introducing distractedly, saying to do something in a distracted way, well, that's either not very helpful if the student doesn't know the word distracted, or if the student does know the word distracted, then maybe I need to take a step back and say, is this a word that I need to be introducing right now? Is this my priority for this text? Because that's not going to be too difficult for students to figure out if they know the word distracted. And using other words that students are likely not to know. I'm sure you've seen this in a dictionary where you look for a word that is fairly simple and it's defined with much more difficult words. So distinguished, authoritative, marked by eminence, that's not going to help our students understand, because if they don't know distinguished, they probably don't know authoritative or marked by eminence either. So let's look at some example definitions for the word confusion. So I'm going to show you these definitions, and I'd like you to think about whether it's a great classroom definition or if it has one of these problems that we're talking about, relying on a closely related word, using other words that students don't know, or abstract expressions. So the first one, and if you'd like to type the letter in the chat box, that's great as well. If things are a little hazy or you feel bewildered, you are in a state of confusion. So how would you assess this definition? So yeah, this is definitely C, right? It uses other words that students are likely not to know. Feeling confused. It's pretty straightforward. So that's relying on a really closely related word, right? Confusion and confused, those are really, really closely tied. The state of being unclear in one's mind about something. What would this be? Yeah, this is D, definitely. Uses a couple of these abstract expressions, the state of and one. And last, if you're not quite sure what's going on, you are experiencing confusion, right? So this is a great classroom definition. So let's look at some more examples of ELL friendly definitions. So abundant, if something is abundant, there is more than enough of it. Selfish, when someone only thinks about their own wants and needs, they are being selfish. Ecstatic, being ecstatic means that you are very happy and excited about something. So one thing you might notice straight away is that for these ELL friendly definitions or learner friendly definitions, we can put that word into the context of the sentence in a way that dictionary definitions don't usually do. So you might notice that I'm using these structures. If something is target word, it is something else. When someone, and I describe it, they are being target word, or being target word means that you, and this really allows it to, it also makes it clearer what part of speech this word is. So that really makes it more helpful to students. So good definitions are important. We don't ever want to skip that very important step of defining the word well, but it is not enough for vocabulary learning. So basing vocabulary learning solely off of definitions can often lead to misinterpretation, right? So now we're going to look at some activities. So what do we aim to do with vocabulary practice? We want to actively engage students in word learning. We want to expose students to words repeatedly across a variety of contexts. And we want to help students personalize word learning. So the two exercises I'm going to show you can be adapted for either very young students or all the way up to high school students, depending on how we plan them. So this first exercise I call this or that questions. So the objective is to get students to identify the subtle differences that are the essence of a word's meaning. So for this activity, we start by presenting students with two options that are similar in some ways, but in which only one of these options actually applies to the vocabulary word. So we have students decide which sentence fits with the meaning of the vocabulary word and explain why. So let's look at an example of this. So I could ask students, which situation would make you feel disappointed? Your mom gives you a new eraser for the first day of school, or your mom gives you a new eraser as a birthday present. So we can see that there's a lot in common in these two sentences, but they're obviously also very different. Only one of them would really make us feel disappointed, right? So if we are asking students to explain why does that sentence work and why doesn't the other sentence work, we might get answers that have to do with, on the first day of school, I'm not really expecting anything special, so an eraser is great. But on my birthday, well, I expect a nice present on my birthday. I expect something special, right? So if they're giving us that answer, they are already figuring out that disappointed has to do with expectation, right? So if we are just reading the word disappointed in context, a student might think that disappointed is just a synonym for sad. But disappointed isn't just about being sad. It also has to do with, I was expecting this and what I got was so much less, right? So here's another one. This one is a little bit more simple, might be for younger students. If you wanted to see something magnificent, where would you go? An art museum or a grocery store, right? So here, when students start talking about why you might not expect to see something magnificent at the grocery store, they might tell you, well, those are everyday things, or there's a lot of the same things. They're mass produced, right? At an art museum, things are unique. Things are special. These are things that someone made and could never be made the same, right? So it's something very special. So I'd like you to think of some other examples. So what could you ask students here? Which would you be astounded to see on your school playground? So think about two options that you could give students for this. So for this example, what I came up with, I was thinking, okay, I'm going to choose two different birds, right? So astounded, a pigeon or an ostrich. So obviously an ostrich is not something that I expect to see. That would surprise me, right? Oh, so great. I see some people participating in the chat room. A snake or a football, a seagull or a dinosaur. Great. A petting zoo or a new swing. Okay. And again, we don't want to forget this important step, asking students to explain their thinking, why, and how would they feel about the other option. So this second exercise that I'm going to show you is one of my favorite things to do with students, actually. And the objective here is to get students to think creatively about how a word's meaning fits a situation. So first, we're going to choose pictures that show objects or situations that could be described by students' vocabulary words. Then if you're working with elementary school students, I would definitely recommend that you print these pictures so that they can manipulate them. Or if you're working with middle or high school students, you might just project them. That would be fine as well. And have students work in pairs or small groups to match the words to the pictures. So I really suggest that this be done in pairs or small groups and not individually, because a lot of this rich thinking and explaining their reasoning can happen with their peers, right? And then you can, as a class, come together and explain why the picture fits with the vocabulary word. And you can also compare, did somebody come up with a different explanation for this word? Did someone pair it differently than I did? So here's an example exercise. So these are 4 vocabulary words that I have done with 4th graders, 4th grade Spanish speakers. So take a look at those words and think about which you might pair. Okay, so when I planned this example, or this exercise, sorry, what I was expecting to see were these pairings, right? So player number 21 is especially tall. A platypus is a peculiar animal. The little boy is jealous of his baby brother, which I've seen in the chat as well. The girl really enjoys riding her bicycle, right? And all of these are definitely valid, and they're great if students answer these and can explain why they have chosen these words. But what I found is that a lot of the time students also came up with unexpected answers, right? So here I'm showing you different ways that you could pair these words. So it's peculiar to ride your bike with your feet up, right? The little boy does not enjoy having a baby brother. Many animals are interesting, but platypuses are especially cool. And other players must be jealous of how tall player number 21 is. He can make baskets so easily, right? So for my students, it actually became, for the most skilled students, it kind of became a challenge that they gave themselves to pair words with things that I wouldn't expect. So they would think, Miss Christine is expecting me to put peculiar with the platypus. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to put some other word with platypus. And as long as they can explain their reasoning, and as long as it makes sense, that is really, really great, because they're actually stretching themselves to create a context in which the word fits the meaning, right? Sometimes, of course, it can go wrong, and we might need to bring them back and say, that doesn't really work for this and this and this reason. But that's also a really great learning opportunity, right? And of course, then ask students why. So variations on this for increased or reduced difficulty, if pairing the same number of pictures to the amount of vocabulary words is too difficult, we can increase the number of pictures so that they have more words to choose from. So if we have 5 vocabulary words, we can also give them, 7 or 8 pictures to make it a little bit easier. We can also, if we, on the other hand, want to make it more difficult, we can choose more ambiguous pictures. For high school students, we might not want to use examples as straightforward as the ones that I just showed you. We might show pictures that have a little more complexity to them, and have students really have to think about how the word would fit the situation. And we can also, just for the sake of variety, we can also do other things instead of pictures. So we can have students match words to dialogue quotes or phrases, or a description, a short description of a situation. So once my students were already familiar with this picture exercise, I did this with dialogue quotes as well, and it was very easy for them to transfer their they understood very easily how to do this activity as well. So things like if I gave them these quotes, they could realize that, I'm mentioning that my birthday is next Saturday, or if I can't find my keys, another way to say that would be, my keys vanished. Or if the concert is starting, I can't believe we've been waiting 2 hours. I might say, finally, this concert is starting. Or if someone says, you should take some extra socks for your hike, they are suggesting that I take extra socks, right? So this would be a different way of applying the same type of exercise. And for this last section of the webinar, motivating students to make new words their own, right? So the first thing is getting students excited about words, creating an environment where words are a source of interest and curiosity. So as a teacher, we want to model a love of words. We want to talk about words, notice them, show appreciation for words. When a student uses a vocabulary word that we weren't expecting, be able to notice that. Or when we are reading, say, even if that word isn't one of the ones we will be targeting, say, that's such a good word, right? Or I heard somebody say this or that yesterday. Show them excitement about words. We also want to push students by using more challenging words in oral speech. So this is especially important for students if English is not their native language, because they're not going to get this in everyday life, right? So everyday situations provide much richer context for students to pick up on new words. So you can naturally introduce much more complex or difficult words than you might get away with in reading and writing, right? So if I'm coming into the classroom on a hot summer day and the windows are closed and we're sweating and super hot, then if I say, oh my goodness, I'm sweltering, it's sweltering in here. Can somebody turn on the fan? Can you open the window? The context is so rich that it's not going to be difficult for students to understand what I'm saying, right? And that doesn't need to be something that that students are expected to reproduce or incorporate in their language. I'm just introducing this word in a passing way, right? And having students keep a vocabulary notebook. So we don't want to overuse this. We don't want students writing down every single word that they encounter that they're unfamiliar with. But if we encourage students to monitor their own understanding and notice their words that they see and to want to talk about words, a vocabulary notebook can be something that they can keep as an extra thing, maybe not for the words that we're introducing as a class, but say, oh, this word came up and I asked my teacher about it and I thought it was a great word, so I'm going to write that one down, right? So things like that can just get students excited about words. Another important thing is finding an audience for students writing. So an authentic audience can be students' families, other members of their school, if we have panels or other ways that we can introduce students' work to other members of the school. Depending on students' age, even social media, if we want to have a classroom, ongoing dictionary Instagram account that students can set up, or even just their peers, right? So having students know that other people are seeing what they're working on is really great as well. So for instance, once students have practiced with vocabulary words, having them write their own sentences and then finding ways to show off their work. Some ways that we can do this are to select some examples for slides presentation or word wall. So maybe if I have 2 weeks of vocabulary instruction, at the end of week 1, examples that students have come up with and that I thought were really great, I might showcase these in a slides presentation, and that gets students so excited that their example was shown. And a lot of the time students come up with better examples, more fun examples than a teacher can, because they relate them to their own experiences. And that makes it really fun for their peers as well. Creating a classroom dictionary together, whether on paper or digital. So using students' example sentences and even their illustrations to create this dictionary together and make it something that is actually used in the classroom. You know, if you don't remember that vocabulary word that we did a couple months ago and that has come up again in our reading, why don't you go check the classroom dictionary? And in that classroom dictionary, they're going to have their own classmates' example sentences. We can also use them to create a practice worksheet or crossword puzzle for their peers. My students love when I put their example sentences, create these fill in the blank type exercises with their own examples or crossword puzzles. They get really, really excited. The one thing I wouldn't recommend is using this for assessment, but if this practice worksheet is something that they're just going to do with the sole purpose of practice, that's really, really great. So today we've talked about choosing words to teach, so prioritizing quality over quantity, prioritizing text comprehension, choosing words that students will be able to use in other situations, as far as creating friendly definitions using simple language and making these definitions as situated and concrete as possible. The practice activities we talked about, this or that questions and the picture matching, and always have students explain their reasoning. And lastly, motivating students to make new words their own, how to create a word-loving environment, really inspire kids to want to use these words, and finding an authentic audience for students writing. So 2 books that I have found extremely helpful in learning about vocabulary instruction and learning new activities that I could do with students are these 2, bringing words to life and creating robust vocabulary. So I definitely recommend these. So great, thank you. It has been lovely talking to you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Christina. If everybody can give Christina a virtual round of applause, I believe that we all took so much from her session. I know that I myself learned so many great tips. Vocabulary is something that can be fun and should be fun in the classroom. Christina, I love your comment about dictionary definitions are not always student friendly, but classroom definitions should be. That will definitely be something that I take away and put into my practice. I also love that the ideas that you shared today can be used in any classroom setting. The different activities I thought can be used face to face in our traditional settings, but they were very applicable also if we find ourselves teaching in a distance learning setting. So thank you so much for those practical ideas that we can use tomorrow, no matter what setting we are teaching in. Now, ladies and gentlemen, if you are interested in also looking for some additional support to your vocabulary instruction that can work in parallel with the wonderful ideas and research that Christina shared with us today, please feel free to check out learningatozee.com. You can sign up for a free trial for any of our programs. Specifically, you might want to check out Vocabulary A to Z, which is designed to give students practice with vocabulary. And it's also designed to give you teaching tools that you can use in any classroom setting. Also, in addition to checking out Learning A to Z, we encourage you to sign up for our next speaker series event, which is just in 2 days. And at that event, we will be hosting Richard Siddhartha, who is going to be talking about the heart of education and really supporting social and emotional learning in our classrooms, which we know is so important today. And then finally, as we close up today, we want to let you know that we will be downloading a list of everybody that attended our session live today. And we will be putting all of your names into a randomizer. and selecting one lucky winner who will receive a 1 year access to RAS Plus. And we will be sure to email everybody out who that winner is and make sure that we are getting in contact with the lucky winner. So be sure to be checking your email. We'll be following up with information about the winner, and we'll also be sending out this recording so that you can share this with your colleagues or review it again as you would like. And with that said, everybody, we want to again thank you so much for your time today. I know that we all took away so much from this presentation. Christina, thank you so much for sharing your expertise and your passion for supporting learners with vocabulary and literacy and language. Again, round of applause to Christina, and we thank you all so much and hope that you have a wonderful day. Thank you.